Growing up in my family meant growing up with labels. Reflective. Everyone had one, and once it stuck, it never really went away. My older sister Emily was the successful one. She was the kind of child parents loved to brag about at dinner parties. Straight A's, student, council, president, captain of the debate team. Emily did everything right. Teachers adored her, relatives admired her, and my parents practically built a shrine to her report cards on the refrigerator. Whenever family visited, my mom would pull out photo albums or school certificates like they were trophies. Emily worked so hard for this, she would say proudly, as if the rest of us were supporting characters in the story of her brilliance. Then, there was my cousin Jake, who my family called the genius. Jake could do math problems in his head faster than most adults could with a calculator. By the time he was 16, he was already talking about engineering programs and internships. My uncles would pat him on the back and say things like, "This kid is going places." Every holiday dinner included a new story about Jake's academic achievements. If Emily was the family's golden star, Jake was the rising comet everyone was excited to watch. And then there was me. In our family's quiet hierarchy, I was the one who didn't quite fit anywhere. No one ever officially called me the failure, at least not directly. My parents would never use that exact word. Instead, it lived in the way they spoke to me, the way they sighed after asking about my life, the way conversations about my future always ended with uncomfortable silence. My label came through softer phrases, phrases that sounded polite on the surface, but carried the same meaning underneath. "Still working that little online thing?" my aunt would ask with a careful smile during family gatherings. My dad had his own version. He would lean back in his chair, shake his head gently, and say something like, "You know, college would have helped you a lot. A degree opens doors." My mom preferred sympathy over criticism. She'd place a hand on my shoulder and speak in the kindest voice imaginable. "We just worry about you, honey. You've always been different." Different. That word followed me everywhere. Different meant I didn't stay in college like Emily did. Different meant I left halfway through my second year, because sitting in lecture halls listening to professors talk about theories felt like suffocating. Different meant I didn't apply for corporate internships or build a LinkedIn profile like everyone expected. Instead, I spent nights at my laptop teaching myself skills from random corners of the internet, writing content, managing social media accounts, learning basic web design. To my family, that didn't look like ambition. It looked like confusion. At every holiday dinner, there was a predictable pattern. Emily would talk about her latest promotion or work project, and the entire table would listen with admiration. Jake would explain something complicated about research or engineering, and the adults would nod proudly, like they understood every detail. When it was finally my turn to speak, the atmosphere would shift. Someone would clear their throat, someone else would glance at their watch, and then the inevitable question would come. "So, how's your little side project going?" The first few times it happened, I tried to explain. I talked about freelance clients, about learning marketing strategies, about building websites for small businesses. I described how the internet allowed people to work from anywhere and how digital services were growing quickly. But the more I explained, the more confused they looked. To them, success meant a diploma on the wall and a steady paycheck from a recognizable company. Anything else felt unstable, temporary, or unrealistic. My explanation sounded less like a career plan and more like excuses. Eventually, I stopped trying. Instead, I just smiled politely and gave short answers. "It's going fine. It's growing slowly. I'm figuring things out." Those words became my shield. They kept the conversation from going deeper. They also kept my family comfortable with the version of me they had already decided was true. Sometimes their jokes were subtle. Other times, they weren't. One Thanksgiving, my uncle laughed and said, "You're lucky your parents are patient. If my kid dropped out of college, I'd make him join the military the next day. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, even though something inside me tightened. Another time, during a Christmas dinner, Emily mentioned a big project she was leading at work. The entire table applauded her dedication. Then my aunt turned to me and said, "Well, not everyone is meant for the corporate world. Some people just need more time to find their path." I knew she meant it kindly, but it still felt like a quiet confirmation of what everyone believed. Over time, I noticed something interesting. The more my family assumed I was failing, the less they asked about the details of my life. They stopped questioning my plans. They stopped giving advice. It was almost like they had already accepted that I would eventually figure things out, or not, and there wasn't much they could do about it. Oddly enough, that distance gave me freedom. Without constant scrutiny, I was able to experiment. I could fail privately, learn quietly, and improve without announcing every step to people waiting for proof that I was wrong. While my relatives joked about my little online projects, I was spending 12-hour days working with clients across different time zones. I wrote articles for websites that got thousands of views. I managed advertising campaigns for businesses that relied on online customers. Every new task forced me to learn something new. The work wasn't glamorous. Most nights I sat alone in my small apartment, surrounded by coffee cups and sticky notes full of ideas and deadlines. Sometimes I wondered if my family might be right. Maybe I had taken the harder path for no reason. Maybe the traditional route would have been safer. But every once in a while, something would happen that reminded me why I started. A client would send a message saying their sales doubled after a campaign I built. A small business owner would thank me for helping them grow. A payment notification would arrive that was bigger than the last one. Those moments felt like quiet victories. My family didn't see any of it. To them, I was still the girl who dropped out of college and disappeared into the internet, still the one who hadn't figured things out, still the one who didn't quite measure up. And honestly, for a long time, I let them believe it. Because while they were busy laughing at my uncertainty, I was busy building something they didn't understand yet. 3 years passed in a way that felt both slow and incredibly fast. On the surface, nothing about my life looked impressive. I still lived in the same modest apartment, still worked from my laptop most days, and still avoided talking about my career whenever family asked. From the outside, it probably looked like I was stuck in the same uncertain phase everyone had predicted for me. My family barely noticed the passing time. In their minds, my story had already been written. I was the one who dropped out of college and wandered into the vague world of online work. They assumed I was barely getting by, piecing together small freelance jobs and hoping something would eventually work out. Whenever I visited home for holidays, the conversations were always the same. "Are you saving anything?" my dad would ask cautiously. "You know, there are still good colleges that accept transfer students," my mom would remind me. Sometimes they would suggest job openings they'd seen online, administrative assistant positions, entry-level office work, anything that sounded stable. I knew they meant well. They genuinely believed they were helping me find a safer path. I would nod, thank them for the suggestions, and promise to think about it. Then I would go back to my apartment and open my laptop, returning to the life they couldn't see. When I first started freelancing, everything felt chaotic. I didn't have a clear plan. I just knew I didn't want to return to a classroom where every lecture felt like a countdown to someone else's version of success. Instead, I spent hours searching online platforms for freelance work. I offered to write blog posts, manage social media pages, design simple websites, anything that matched the skills I was slowly teaching myself. The first year was brutal. There were nights when I stared at my bank account and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. Some months I barely made enough to cover rent and groceries. Clients disappeared without paying. Projects took longer than expected. I worked late into the night, trying to meet deadlines that barely paid anything. During that time, my family's doubts echoed in my mind more than I liked to admit. Maybe they were right. Maybe dropping out had been reckless. Maybe I'd chosen pride over practicality. But every time I thought about giving up and applying for a traditional job, something inside me resisted. I had tasted a different kind of independence, even if it was messy and uncertain. The idea of giving that up felt worse than struggling a little longer. Slowly, things began to change. My first breakthrough came from a small bakery in another state. The owner had posted a job asking for help with social media marketing. Their Instagram page had barely any followers, and they wanted someone to help them attract local customers. I offered to manage their account for a modest monthly fee. At first, I wasn't sure what I was doing. I experimented with posting schedules, photos, captions, and simple promotions. I read marketing blogs late at night, trying to understand how businesses used the internet to grow. Within 3 months, the bakery's online following tripled. Customers started mentioning Instagram posts when they walked into the store. The owner sent me a message one evening that I still remember clearly. "I don't know what you're doing," she wrote, "but our sales have increased since you started helping us." That message felt like proof that I was moving in the right direction. Soon after, the bakery owner recommended me to a friend who ran a small clothing boutique. That led to another client, and then another. Each project taught me something new about advertising, branding, and online growth. I spent hours analyzing what worked and what didn't, slowly building a system that helped small businesses reach more customers. By the middle of my second year, freelancing had become more than just random gigs. I had regular clients who trusted my work. My income wasn't huge yet, but it was steady enough that I no longer worried about rent every month. That was when I started thinking bigger. Instead of working alone on every project, I began hiring other freelancers to help with specialized tasks. One designer helped create graphics for advertising campaigns. Another writer assisted with blog content. A web developer joined occasionally when clients needed more complex websites. At first, coordinating everything felt overwhelming. I had to manage deadlines, communicate with multiple people, and make sure every client received high-quality work. But once the system started working, something incredible happened. My time became more valuable. Instead of completing every task myself, I focused on strategy and client relationships. I helped businesses design marketing plans while my small team handled the technical details. Projects that once took weeks could now be completed in days. That shift changed everything. By the start of the third year, what began as freelance work had quietly turned into a digital marketing agency. It wasn't a fancy company with an office building or a big staff. Most of us worked remotely from different cities. But the results were real. We managed advertising campaigns for small companies that relied heavily on online customers. Some of our clients were local shops trying to compete with bigger chains. Others were online stores looking to expand their reach. Every successful campaign brought more referrals. Business owners talk to each other, especially when something works. One client would recommend us to another, and suddenly my inbox would have 3 new inquiries. The growth felt organic and steady, like a snowball slowly gaining momentum as it rolled downhill. By the end of that third year, I sometimes paused in disbelief while reviewing the numbers. Revenue that once seemed impossible had become routine. My small team had grown into a reliable network of freelancers who trusted me to keep projects flowing. But despite all that progress, I never told my family. It wasn't because I wanted to hide my success out of spite. It was something quieter than that. I had spent so many years trying to convince them that my path made sense. Explaining my work had always turned into awkward conversations or gentle skepticism. Eventually, I realized something important. Not everyone needs to understand your journey while you're still walking it. So when my parents asked how things were going, I kept my answers simple. It's going okay. I'm staying busy. I'm still freelancing. Those words weren't lies. They were just incomplete truths. My relatives continued believing that I was struggling to find direction, and I didn't correct them. They had already decided what my story looked like. Arguing with that assumption felt exhausting and pointless. Instead, I focused on the life I was building quietly. While my family pictured me sitting alone with a laptop and uncertain income, I was negotiating contracts, planning marketing campaigns, and coordinating projects with clients around the world. The funny part was that the silence worked in my favor. Without constant opinions or expectations, I had the freedom to grow at my own pace. To them, I was still the girl who hadn't figured things out. But behind the scenes, everything was starting to come together. The reunion was supposed to be simple, just a family gathering to celebrate my grandmother's 75th birthday. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just dinner, cake, and the usual conversations that happen when relatives who rarely see each other sit around a long table pretending they know what's going on in everyone else's life. My aunt had reserved a private room in a large restaurant downtown. When I arrived, the place was already buzzing with voices. The smell of food drifted through the air, mixed with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Round tables filled the room, but our family had pushed several together to make one long arrangement that could seat nearly everyone. There were easily 30 relatives there. Uncles I hadn't seen in years, cousins who had grown up and brought their own partners, a few distant family friends, who somehow always showed up to these events. The room had that familiar feeling of forced closeness, people hugging a little too tightly, asking questions they didn't really want full answers to. "Look who's here!" my aunt called out when she saw me walk in. Several heads turned toward the door. My mom waved me over enthusiastically. "There she is." I smiled and walked toward the table, greeting people as I passed. My grandmother sat at the center, looking delighted by the attention. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she held everyone's hands as they leaned down to wish her a happy birthday. When she saw me, her face lit up. "My quiet one," she said warmly, squeezing my hand. "You made it." "Of course," I said. "I wouldn't miss it." I found an empty seat halfway down the long table, close enough to be part of the conversation, but far enough to observe everything without being the center of attention. That had always been my preferred position at family events. Across from me sat Emily. She looked exactly like the version of success my parents loved to present to the world. Perfectly styled hair, confident posture, and a phone that seemed to vibrate every few minutes with messages from coworkers or friends. She was wearing a blazer, even though this was technically a casual family dinner. "Hey," she said, giving me a quick smile. "Hey, how have you been?" "Good," I replied. Our conversation ended there, not out of hostility, but simply because we had never been particularly close. Emily lived in a different world. Corporate offices, networking events, long meetings. Our lives had drifted in different directions years ago. Dinner started with the usual chaos. Waiters moved in and out of the room carrying trays of appetizers while people talked over each other. Someone poured wine. Someone else made a toast to my grandmother's health. Laughter echoed around the table as old family stories resurfaced. For a while, everything felt comfortable. Then, the familiar pattern began to emerge. One of my uncles asked Emily about her job, and suddenly, the table's attention shifted to her. She explained a big project she was managing at work and how her company might be expanding next year. My parents listened proudly, nodding at every detail. "That's our girl," my dad said, raising his glass. A few seats down, Jake joined the conversation when someone asked about his graduate program. He started explaining a research project involving renewable energy systems. Half the table didn't fully understand what he was talking about, but that didn't stop them from praising his intelligence. "This kid is going to change the world," one of my cousins joked. Jake laughed modestly, but didn't deny it. I watched the exchange quietly while sipping my drink. The dynamic hadn't changed at all. Emily was still the successful one. Jake was still the genius. The roles everyone played years ago were still firmly in place. Eventually, the attention drifted around the table as people shared updates about their lives. New houses, new jobs, new babies. Each story received polite applause and curious follow-up questions. I knew my turn would come eventually. It always did. Sure enough, about halfway through the meal, my uncle leaned back in his chair and glanced in my direction. "So," he said casually, "what about you?" The conversation slowed slightly. "What have you been up to lately?" A few relatives turned toward me. The question itself wasn't unusual, but the tone carried the same quiet curiosity I'd heard dozens of times before. It wasn't the excitement they showed when asking Emily about promotions or Jake about research breakthroughs. It was the gentle curiosity reserved for someone whose answer probably wouldn't change the evening. Before I could respond, another aunt jumped in with a smile. "She's still doing that freelance thing online, right?" I nodded slightly. "Yeah." My uncle chuckled. "Well, that's one way to stay flexible." A few people laughed politely. Emily glanced up from her phone for a moment but didn't say anything. My mom gave the small sigh I knew too well, the one she used when she didn't want to criticize me directly in front of everyone, but couldn't hide her concern either. "Well," she said carefully, "she's figuring things out." The words floated across the table like a quiet conclusion. Figuring things out. The phrase had followed me for years. It sounded supportive on the surface, but underneath it carried a subtle message. Not there yet. Still uncertain. Still trying to catch up. Most people nodded and returned to their conversations, satisfied with the explanation. But something about that moment felt different. Maybe it was the way the conversation had dismissed me so quickly. Maybe it was the years of listening to the same assumptions about my life. Or maybe it was simply that I had finally reached a point where those assumptions no longer had any power over me. For a second, I considered giving my usual answer. "It's going okay. I'm staying busy." The safe, vague responses that kept the evening moving without drawing attention. But as I looked around the table, at my parents, my sister, my relatives who had quietly labeled me years ago, I realized something. They weren't being cruel. They were just repeating the story they believed was true. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely calm about it. Because while they were discussing promotions, research programs, and corporate milestones, I was thinking about the projects waiting in my inbox tomorrow morning. Clients from 3 different countries, campaigns launching next week, contracts worth more than anyone at this table probably imagined. The strange part was that I didn't feel the need to prove anything. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet sense of readiness. My uncle leaned forward slightly, still waiting for my answer. "So?" he asked again with a friendly grin. "How's that freelancing life treating you?" For the first time in years, instead of giving the short, polite response everyone expected, I leaned back in my chair and smiled. "Actually," I said calmly, "things are going pretty well." The words hung in the air for a moment. "Actually," I repeated calmly, "things are going pretty well." It wasn't a dramatic statement, but it was enough to keep the conversation from moving on the way it normally did. A few people who had already turned back to their meals paused and glanced toward me again. My uncle raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" he said with a small laugh. "That's good. Freelancing can be tough though. Hard to make real money doing that, right?" A couple of relatives chuckled softly, not in a cruel way, just the kind of casual laughter people use when they assume something is harmlessly true. I shrugged slightly. It depends. That answer made a few more people look up. Across the table, Jake leaned forward with mild curiosity, resting his elbows near his plate. Emily finally set her phone down and looked at me directly for the first time that evening. "What do you mean, Shatsir?" "Hachari Nini," she asked. I could feel the room shifting just slightly. Not tense yet, just curious. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, placing it on the table in front of me. My movements were slow and casual, like I was checking a message rather than preparing to say something important. "I started a digital marketing company a few years ago," I explained. "We help small businesses run advertising campaigns online." My aunt nodded politely, though the expression on her face suggested she wasn't entirely sure what that meant. "Oh, that's nice," she said. Another uncle added, "So like social media stuff?" "Partly," I replied. "Ads, strategy, content, websites, a little of everything." A few people murmured understanding, though most of them still looked like they were trying to place this information somewhere within their understanding of careers. To them, it probably still sounded like a slightly more organized version of freelancing. Jake tilted his head thoughtfully. "So you run the whole thing yourself?" "Not exactly," I said. "I manage a team of freelancers now. Designers, writers, developers. We work remotely." Emily's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine attention. "How long have you been doing that?" she asked. "About 3 years." "3 years?" she repeated. My dad frowned slightly, like he was trying to recall whether he had ever heard me mention something like that before. "You never said it was a company," he said slowly. I smiled gently. I tried explaining it a few times in the beginning. No one responded to that. The waiter came by to refill drinks, briefly interrupting the moment. Conversations around the table quieted again once he left. My uncle leaned back in his chair, still smiling. "Well, running a business is impressive," he said. "But those things take time to grow." "They do," I agreed. Emily crossed her arms lightly. "So, how big is it now?" she asked. The question wasn't hostile, but there was a quiet challenge in her voice. Emily had spent her entire career climbing corporate ladders where growth came with titles and promotions. In her world, success was measured in steps that everyone understood. What I was describing didn't fit that system. I picked up my phone and unlocked it. "Pretty good," I said simply. My aunt laughed lightly. "Well, that's mysterious." I hesitated for a moment, not because I was nervous, but because the truth suddenly felt strangely surreal in this room. For years, these same people had watched me with quiet concern or mild disappointment. Now, I was about to give them a number that would completely rewrite the story they believed about me. But the funny thing was, I didn't feel angry about it. If anything, I felt calm. I turned the phone around on the table so the screen faced my dad and the relatives sitting closest to him. "My net worth passed about 2.3 million this year," I said. For a second, no one reacted. It was like the words needed time to settle into the room before anyone could process them. Then, everything stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Someone accidentally tapped a glass too hard against the table, making a sharp clink that echoed through the quiet room. Emily blinked at me like she was waiting for a punchline. Jake frowned, his analytical brain clearly trying to calculate whether I was serious. My dad let out a short, confused laugh. "Wait. What?" My aunt leaned forward slightly. "Did you say 2 million?" I nodded calmly. 2.3. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. My dad stared at the phone screen in front of him. On it was a dashboard from one of my business accounts, monthly revenue numbers, client contracts, analytics from advertising campaigns. The numbers weren't hidden or exaggerated. They were simply there. He leaned closer, squinting slightly. That can't be right, he muttered. Jake pushed his chair back and stood up just enough to see the screen better. His eyes moved across the data quickly. That's real, he said slowly. My aunt covered her mouth with her hand. Oh my God. Across the table, Emily's face had gone completely still. She looked from the phone to me and back again, like she was trying to connect two completely different versions of reality. You're serious? She asked quietly. Yes. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then the whispers began. 2 million? How did that happen? From freelancing? My uncle shook his head in disbelief. Hold on, he said. You're telling me that little online business made you a millionaire? I shrugged again. It grew faster than I expected. My mom had been quiet this entire time. When I finally looked at her, she seemed pale. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. You never told us, she said softly. I tried, I replied gently. A few years ago. No one laughed anymore. The same relatives who once asked about my little online project were now staring at me with expressions that ranged from shock to fascination. It was like someone had quietly replaced the person they thought they knew with someone else entirely. Emily leaned back in her chair slowly. So, you run a company, she said. Yes. And you're worth over $2 million. Yes. The words sounded almost strange spoken out loud. My uncle rubbed his forehead. Well, he said after a long pause, that explains a lot. But the truth was, it didn't. Not really, because the girl sitting at this table was the same one they had always known. The only difference was that tonight, for the first time, they were finally seeing the full story. For the next few minutes, the room felt strangely unbalanced, like the center of gravity had shifted and everyone was trying to adjust. Conversations that had once flowed easily now moved in cautious bursts. People glanced at me differently, their expressions carrying a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite name. Questions began arriving, one after another. How did you do it? My uncle asked, leaning forward again. When did this happen? Another relative added. Why didn't you ever say anything? Someone from the other end of the table called out. I answered calmly, explaining the basics. I talked about starting with freelance clients, about learning digital marketing, about slowly building a network of freelancers who helped me grow the business. I kept my explanations simple because most of them weren't interested in technical details. What fascinated them was the transformation they hadn't seen coming. For years, they had thought they understood my story. Now they were realizing they had missed almost all of it. My dad was still staring at my phone as if the numbers might suddenly rearrange themselves into something more believable. So, this company, it's yours? He asked again. Yes. And people work for you? Mostly freelancers, I said. But yes. He leaned back in his chair slowly, exhaling like someone who had just finished a long mental calculation. I had no idea, he murmured. Across the table, Jake was asking more technical questions. What kind of campaigns do you run? He said. Search ads? Social media? Both, I replied. Depends on the client. He nodded thoughtfully, clearly fascinated by the business side of something he had probably never considered before. But the reaction that interested me the most came from Emily. She had been quiet for several minutes, watching the conversation unfold. Emily had always been confident in family gatherings, comfortable being the center of attention when people praised her career. Tonight, for the first time, She seemed slightly unsure of where she fit in the conversation. Finally, she spoke. "Well," she said slowly, "you should have told us." The words weren't harsh, but they carried a subtle hint of frustration. I looked at her calmly. "I tried to tell you years ago." The table went quiet again. Emily opened her mouth slightly, then closed it. For a moment, she looked like she was searching her memory, replaying old conversations she may have dismissed at the time. My mom spoke next. "We thought you were struggling," she admitted. "I know," I said. My dad cleared his throat, looking suddenly uncomfortable. "We were worried about you," he said. "I know," I repeated. And the truth was, I believed them. My parents had never wanted me to fail. Their concern had been genuine. The problem wasn't that they didn't care. The problem was that they had only recognized one version of success. Anything outside that framework felt uncertain to them. One of my cousins shook his head with a laugh. "Well, I guess we all underestimated you." A few people chuckled nervously. My aunt leaned toward me with wide eyes. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked. "Are you going to expand the company?" "Probably," I said. "We're already working with more international clients." The questions kept coming, but something about the attention felt strange. For years, I had sat quietly at this same kind of table while conversations moved around me like I was barely part of them. Now everyone wanted to hear my thoughts, my plans, my advice. It would have been easy to feel triumphant, easy to enjoy the sudden respect, but instead, I felt something quieter. Distance. Because the truth was, the most important part of my journey had already happened long before this dinner. It happened during the nights when I was struggling alone in my apartment, unsure if my work would ever succeed. It happened during the moments when clients trusted me with their businesses, and I delivered results. It happened during the slow realization that I didn't need anyone's approval to keep moving forward. Those moments had built my confidence piece by piece. Not this conversation. My dad looked at me again, his expression softer now. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. The words surprised me more than the earlier disbelief. For a second, I studied his face, trying to decide whether the statement was automatic or sincere. But his voice carried a kind of quiet honesty that made it difficult to doubt. "Thank you," I said. My mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You should come visit more often," she said. "We miss you." I smiled gently. "I will." Across the table, Emily finally relaxed slightly, letting out a small laugh. "You know what the funny part is?" she said. "All this time we thought you were the one who didn't have things figured out." I raised an eyebrow playfully. "Turns out we were wrong." "Maybe," I said. The conversation slowly returned to normal after that, though the atmosphere had permanently changed. People were still celebrating my grandmother's birthday, still laughing and sharing stories, but every now and then, someone would glance at me with a new kind of curiosity. The girl they once worried about had quietly become something none of them expected. But by the time the dinner ended and people started gathering their coats, the excitement around my success had already begun to fade. And that was perfectly fine with me. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, the noise of the restaurant faded behind me. The city lights reflected softly on the street, and for a moment I stood there alone, breathing in the quiet. Inside, my relatives were probably still talking about the number I had mentioned earlier. 2.3 million. But the funny thing was, that number didn't feel like the real victory. The real victory had happened years earlier, the moment I stopped trying to convince people to believe in my path. Success hadn't come from proving them wrong. It had come from continuing forward even when they didn't understand, because the people who underestimate you often aren't trying to hurt you. They're simply seeing the world through their own limited expectations, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let them keep those expectations while you quietly build something bigger. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because my family finally saw me differently, but because I realized I didn't need them to. For the first time in a long time, the story of my life felt completely my own.